Tesla is dominating the EV market. But what if I told you General Motors could have got that title way before Tesla, but purposely chose not to? You'd probably think this is the usual story of a corporate conspiracy, some organised shutdown by oil companies. But if we look closer at the details, a much darker story emerges. This is the story of the 1996 GM EV1, the electric vehicle that got mysteriously shut down. In the mid-90s, this was the most advanced vehicle on the planet. It featured a heat pump for climate control, regenerative braking, magnesium wheels, and an aluminum chassis. All of these technologies are now a standard in today's electric vehicles, but were science fiction back in 1996. Owners were held vigils for these cars. Some even offered to pay the full value, which was around $25,000 just to keep them. Yet by 2003, nearly every single one of them was gone. They weren't sold to enthusiasts or transitioned to the secondary market. They were repossessed by General Motors, loaded onto flatbeds, and hauled to a facility in the Arizona desert to be crushed into scrap metal. A few dozen survived, but only as museum artifacts, forever banned from public roads. In 1990, the California Air Resources Board was dealing with a smog crisis. Their solution was the zero-emission vehicle mandate. It required that 2% of a manufacturer's sales in California be zero-emission vehicles by 1998, scaling up to 10% by 2003. So for a company like General Motors, it was a threat to their ability to sell cars in their most lucrative market. They started it because they were legally required to, and moreover, the engineering task was huge. At the time, battery technology was essentially frozen in the Industrial Revolution era. To get even a 70-mile range, the car had to be impossibly light and impossibly slippery through the air. This is why the EV1 looks the way it does. The teardrop shape and the rear track being 9 inches narrower than the front were functional requirements to allow the body to taper for maximum aerodynamic efficiency. GM built a completely new platform called the Impact. But here is where the first business contradiction appears. Most car companies, when faced with a mandate, try to build the cheapest version of a compliant product, often a compliance car that is just a gas vehicle with its engine swapped for an electric motor. GM did the opposite. They spent around $1 billion developing the EV1 from the ground up. For a car they only intended to produce in tiny numbers, that level of investment is mathematically irrational, unless the final goal was never the car itself. When the EV1 finally hit the streets in Los Angeles and Phoenix, the reaction was unlike anything the car industry had seen. The car was quick, silent, and felt like a gadget from the future. It attracted celebrities and tech enthusiasts who saw it as a status symbol of progress. But if you look at how GM actually marketed the car, things get strange. Car commercials are usually bright, aspirational, and focused on freedom. The commercials for the EV1 were dark and gloomy. One famous ad featured silhouettes of household appliances and living shadows moving through a dim, grey landscape to a haunting score. It didn't explain how the car worked or why you should want it. In fact, many viewers didn't even realise it was a car commercial at all. At the same time, GM refused to sell the car. It was only available through a closed-end lease. You couldn't buy it at the end of the term, even if you wanted to. This created a peculiar tension. On one hand, you had a waiting list of passionate consumers. On the other, you had a manufacturer that seemed to be doing everything in its power to limit the car's reach. Publicly, GM argued that there was no real market for electric cars. They pointed to the high cost and the limited range. But internally, they were seeing something different. They were seeing a consumer base that was willing to overlook those flaws because the experience of driving electric was fundamentally better. This created a paradox. The more the customers loved the car, the more of a problem it became for GM's long-term business model. If you don't want to miss out on anything cars, make sure to subscribe. The EV1 was a hand-built, low-volume, technological marvel. Each car is estimated to have cost GM between $80,000 and $100,000 to produce. They were leasing them for as little as $300 to $500 a month. But the financial bleeding didn't stop at production. In the United States, manufacturers face significant pressure regarding parts availability. While there is no single federal law mandating a 15-year supply, a combination of state laws and federal consumer protection acts effectively require manufacturers to support vehicles for a reasonable period. This is often interpreted as 10 years, and in California, state law required parts over $50 to be available for at least 7 years. For a high-volume car like a Chevy Cavalier, this is easy. For a car like the EV1, which shared almost no parts with any other vehicle in the GM lineup, it was a logistical nightmare. Every unique sensor, every specialised motor controller, and every bespoke body panel would have to be manufactured and kept in warehouses for a decade or more. Then there was the battery problem. The initial batteries were reliable, but heavy and low range. The upgraded batteries that were made of nickel hydride promised much more, but it came with a legal complication. The patents for large format batteries were acquired by Texaco and later Chevron. Suddenly, the very technology needed to make the EV1 viable was controlled by an oil company that had no interest in seeing electric cars succeed, leading to litigation that effectively stalled the technology for that generation. By 2003, the CARB mandate was being successfully challenged in court. The legal stick that forced GM to build the EV1 was being whittled away. Without the mandate, the EV1 shifted from being a compliance tool to a massive corporate liability. This brings us to the moment that cemented the EV1's place in history: the crushing. When the leases expired, GM began taking the cars back. They ignored the protests. They ignored the checks for $25,000 that owners were trying to hand them at the gates of the lots. They loaded the cars onto trucks and sent them to the shredder. From a PR perspective, it was a catastrophe. It looked like a villainous act. But from a legal and corporate perspective, it was a clinical decision. If GM had sold the cars to the enthusiasts, they would have been legally obligated to support them. They would have had to maintain a supply chain for a car that was already a dead end. More importantly, they would be liable for any failures. The EV1 used a high-voltage system that was entirely new to the consumer market. If a 10-year-old EV1 caught fire in a garage due to a battery degradation issue GM hadn't foreseen, the legal exposure would be astronomical because GM, as the primary manufacturer and innovator of the tech, bore the full burden of product liability. By crushing the cars, GM was closing a legal loop. They were terminating the experiment to mitigate long-term risk. But why was it an experiment in the first place? If they knew the economics were bad and the technology was early, why spend $1 billion? This is where the common narrative of failure begins to break down. If you view the EV1 as a consumer product, it was a disaster. It lost money, it was produced in tiny numbers, and it ended in a scrapyard. But if you view it as a research and development project, it was one of the most successful programs in automotive history. In the 1990s, no one knew if a mass-produced electric car was actually possible. No one knew how the power electronics would handle extreme Arizona heat, how consumers would react to charging at home, or how an aluminum chassis would perform with a 1,000-pound battery in the floor over thousands of miles. The EV1 provided GM with a massive amount of real-world data. They learned about thermal management, regenerative braking logic, and the psychology of range anxiety. They essentially paid $1 billion to run a simulation of the future. The DNA of the EV1 didn't die in the desert. The engineers who worked on it, including figures like Bob Purcell, transitioned that knowledge directly into the Chevrolet Volt and the other Chevy EV programs. The inductive charging tech, known as MagnaCharge, informed the development of future wireless charging standards. Even Tesla's founders have cited the EV1 as the spark that convinced them an electric car company was a viable pursuit. The central insight is this: GM didn't kill the EV1, because it didn't work. They killed it because it proved that the car was ready, but the business model wasn't. The infrastructure didn't exist, the battery patents were locked away in litigation, and the traditional business model of selling a car once and then making money on service for 10 years is fundamentally incompatible with a vehicle that has almost no moving parts. The EV1 was a prototype for a reality that wouldn't be profitable for another 20 years. Don't forget to subscribe to Not Miss Anything Cars and Business.